Welcome to Beyond Battles, Overlooked History for World Builders. I'm Andrew Grunowski from Shoestone Publishing. My pronouns are he, him. Vesna, my co-presenter.
Yep. Hi, I'm Vesna Grunowski. I'm also part of Shoestone Publishing.
And we give this presentation annually now. Every year we change up the topics. It's about looking at trends or events in the history of Earth and how you can use those to enrich the world building that you do. As I was saying before we started, I think of fantasy worlds because the history that I'm familiar with is the medieval to Renaissance period. Vesna has a bit of a broader range, but because we're talking about largely about economic trends, social trends, and patterns in history, we can also talk about how how these events can be adapted or used as inspiration in a science fiction world. And we want this presentation to be interactive with people asking questions. We've designed it to fill about half the time with our lecture to really describe a topic. And then we want to talk with the audience about how to riff on it for your world and how to, well, there we go. So Shoestone Publishing is a small press RPG company that we run part-time alongside our day jobs. I am interested in history in world building because I've been playing historical games since I was in high school. I started with Call of Cthulhu and historical fantasy and historical horror, as in Call of Cthulhu. I was a freelance writer for Ars Magica. I played Ars Magica for 15 years before I started writing for it, and then I wrote for it for 8 years. Ars Magica is a historical fantasy game, and we now make another historical fantasy game called Maganomia, which I'll describe at the end. My lovely wife, I met her through our common interest in Ars Magica, and she does have credentials in history.
In fact, I was in the process of doing some PhD work in medieval history when I ran into Andrew, so that worked out for us. Even though I do something different for a living now, I always will have an interest in history, and I tend to build insights from it into everything creative I do, because there's just this full spectrum of, well, humanity. People don't change much over time, it turns out. And so most things that are true of historical periods can be adapted to any gaming and fiction that we tend to be interested in.
I want to say a few words about history because my view of the whole field has changed over the last 30 years. A historian said, as Daniel Cobb in a video lecture series that I saw, said that history is the interpretation of past events. So history actually changes over time, and you'll see this if you read, especially if you read history books from, say, the 19th century and compare them to books that are written in the 21st century about the same period. You're going to see striking differences. History is really the search for meaning, and meaning depends on the perspective of the historian, and it depends on the information that's available. There have been trends in the scholarship of history that are shaping the conclusions of historians today. and also as new people come in. And what I mean by new people is just new historians, but also the discipline of history is more open now to people from different countries, different genders than was true in the past. So the biases are less, biases are still present. They're more diverse, right?
It's not just about the biases either. The thing that's really neat about people who are new to a particular area of history coming into it is that, you know, there are some things that we've been reading for decades at this point where everybody's seen this particular passage. And because of where we come from culturally, for example, it doesn't really strike us as weird. In, you know, coming from, say, the US, a passage about somebody who bathes every day wouldn't necessarily strike us as weird because we take daily showers. Now, somebody from another part of the world where daily showers are not part of the culture might stop and say, hey, wait a second, why is this medieval person like taking a bath every day? That strikes me as kind of odd. And that's just a really silly example that might not have a lot of impact, but there are a lot of these. And, you know, culture is the air that we breathe, and we just tend to not see things that look familiar and tend not to question them. So people who come into the field who are from different cultures, who've had different backgrounds, sometimes really notice things that the rest of us just read over for the 50th time.
And I do want to say history is full of uncomfortable topics. People in the past didn't have the same values that we have. So even our heroes have a dark side. If history always makes you feel good, you're probably doing it wrong. That said, you know, I think history is cool, and I don't need to let that slow us down. In world building, in gaming, in fiction, we have the freedom to cherry pick, to confront difficult topics when it's relevant, when it makes sense, and when it makes a good story. And we can revise or downplay other things. And that's the job of the creator. So for this year's version of Beyond Battles, we've got 3 topics, as always. We're going to spend 8 or 10 minutes to explain the topic, and then we'll have a similar period for discussion about it. And our 3 topics are the legend of King Arthur, something called Clerical Necromancy, which may not be quite what it sounds. And it's not about clerics raising undead in the real world. And the Tudor taming of the nobility, because it's something that I learned recently that really surprised me. I'll tell you the legend of King Arthur. Of course, there are the medieval romances of King Arthur with the Knights of the Round Table. And there's an earlier version where it's believed today that King Arthur is based on a historical figure who emerged from the so-called Dark Ages. It's a period of very scant historical record. After the Romans discontinued their occupation of Britain and withdrew, they didn't just move out the army, they took the whole aristocracy, the ruling elite of the Roman province of Britannia, exited the country. And according to legend, this was a period of chaos and war, famine, destruction, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. A great Celtic king emerged named Arturus because, according to the legend, he was somehow affiliated, inherited authority from Rome, and that was good, and united the Britons. Then there was a violent invasion by Anglos and Saxons, according to legend, and Arthur and his Britons led a valiant fight, and they managed to save half of the island. The other half was conquered by Angles and Saxons after Arthur died. So that's the early form of the King Arthur legend. It's a good story. You can go ahead and use that in your world. And you can also play a game in this world. My company, our company, did not write Age of Arthur. I just happened to have met the fellows who did. I read this game, and it's a good game, so I'm recommending it. If you're excited about this legend, here it is. You can play it, run a campaign in that world. The written form of this early Celtic-based King Arthur legend comes from a medieval book, actually, written 600 years later by a Welsh monk. So in Wales, which is a part of the British Isles that retained Celtic culture, and his book is not accepted by modern historians as factual. To give you an idea of why, it starts out by saying that the original Britons came from ancient Troy under a guy named Brutus and fought against giants and settled in Britain. So what's weird is that this source, which is obviously non-factual, has parts of it that are accepted or were accepted through the 20th century. And the part about the violent invasion by Angles and Saxons was taught to me in US high school as fact. It's not fact. Recent archaeological evidence shows that the Angles and Saxons settled gradually into England. There's no evidence of widespread destruction. There's no evidence of a period of chaos where infighting led to towns being sacked and burned and widespread calamities. There are no battlefields or mass graves that have been found. If there was a violent Saxon invasion, then it was fought using fully compostable weapons. And not many people died. Graves from the period show that about 2% of the deceased people had evidence of a violent injury or death. That's in this documentary where I learned about all this archaeological evidence. The archaeologist said that seems very low. 2% of people dying by violence is not low by modern standards. Violence in the US does not make the top 10 in causes of death, but accidents are about 5% of deaths in the United States in recent years. So we don't worry about that too much. I mean, obviously, we hate to have accidents happen, especially fatal accidents, but our society is not in panic over it. And violence was a lower cause of death at that time than accidents are today. It was much higher than violence is today. So that's a glass that's half empty and half full. I highly recommend the episode of a documentary called Secrets of the Dead that explains all of this 21st century archaeological evidence that's overturned the narrative that we inherited from Geoffrey of Monmouth. And now that I know that Monmouth's portrayal of the Anglo-Saxon settlement is counterfactual, I am willing to speculate. I'm not a professional historian, so I don't need evidence. I can just have opinions. Okay. And I can judge people, which historians tend not to do. So I'm going to judge Geoffrey of Monmouth, and I'm on speculation because I can. I'm going to speculate that he was projecting the Viking invasions onto events from several centuries earlier. From the wrath of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. He was a monk. Vikings raided monasteries, and this was a big deal to monks. So he knew about that, and probably just jumped to conclusions.
And one thing that we probably also shouldn't forget is the view that we have today of writing history is a little bit different. We're trying to write about things that actually happened and explain them. An underlying medieval idea of how to do this is to see a truth about something and write the story that fits your truth. And so, take with a grain of salt, but for gaming, we're lucky we don't have to have it be true. It just has to sound cool and be interesting.
So was there really a high King Arthur who united Britain? Maybe. Don't know. When the Romans pulled out of Britain, it looks like all the scribes either went with them or became unemployed because there aren't written records. And what I know of pre-Roman Celtic culture, they weren't big on writing stuff down. It seems reasonable to me to conjecture that they went back to oral tradition. I do think that Geoffrey of Monmouth didn't make stuff up completely. I think the idea of a Celtic king came from somewhere. Did it come from fact? We don't have evidence. What I find interesting is that Geoffrey of Monmouth's version was just repeated into the 20th century, into my high school. It's worth thinking about how events of the past turn into legend. Where do the legends come from? And when do the legends start? Before I learned about this incident, I was thinking, legends start right after the event. Right? So right after the king, people begin telling stories and there are legends. But King Arthur had a revival. King Arthur became popular in the Middle Ages, 600 years after he could have lived. And that is a really interesting idea that for some reason, I'm going to say influencers in a society, in this case, it was monks. It could be some other segment of society. It could be the ruling class. It could be artists. It could be scientists in a science fiction world discovering fragmentary records, maybe even drawing wrong conclusions from fragmentary records. Scientists can be wrong. They just have a process for correcting their errors when new evidence comes in. So that's what I wanted to say about King Arthur, and let's talk about it. Could it be because it was an attempt to have a totem for chivalry, which was something that was starting to happen? Absolutely. I think that has a lot to do with Geoffrey of Monmouth's book and why it caught on. I think that maybe he was there's a lot going on with Geoffrey of Monmouth because he was British and he was writing at a time when he was Welsh. He was writing at a time when England was ruled by another group of incomers, the Normans, who were not Anglo-Saxon. And I think that a factor could have been to contrast British culture with Anglo-Saxon culture, to delegitimize Anglo-Saxon settlers. But I also think he was, as you suggest, I also think he was trying to appeal to the warrior elite, the Normans who saw themselves as warriors, and to subordinate the warriors to Christianity, because a big attribute of this Celtic Arthur is that he was Christian, fighting against pagans. And that's a theme that you see in chivalry. And this is plausible. The Roman province of Britannia was Christianized along with the rest of the empire. And that's something that stuck. Though the incoming Angles and Saxons didn't bring Christianity with them. They brought their Germanic religion with them, which caught on in Britain for a while. So there was a back and forth there. Any other thoughts about Arthur and his legend? People, historians included, sometimes look to the past to find events for reinforcements of their current identities. I think we see that here.
And there's a lot of it. If you look at Victorian scholarship, it's pretty frightening how they mold the Middle Ages to reinforce their current values and their current ideas of what women are and what men are and how they ought to behave. It's quite astounding also when you read Victorian translations of even something like the Ring of the Nibelungs and then read the original, and you realize that the translation is a very, very sanitized and Victorianized version of the original, in which nobody gets sexually assaulted, for example, in an ugly way, because couldn't possibly be.
Myths or legends are really interesting to me, and I think legends should be important in any world, including the science fiction world. At their best, legends help a society cohere by reinforcing their shared values. We have legends in America that are based on historical events around the War of Independence, right? Around the Boston Tea Party, the famous ride of Paul Revere. These are legends to us. They have a factual basis, but we tell them, I think, because of their value as legends. But there can also be a dark side to legends, like in this one where the Angles and Saxons are portrayed inaccurately as violent invaders, right? And that may be used to speak to the legitimacy of Saxon rulership in England.
And for the sci-fi crowd, I just also want to add that one of the books that it's now not brand new anymore, but one of the books that really impressed me. And now I'm forgetting the title. That's a good showing.
Memories of Empire.
Yes, that's the one. I'm sorry, because I keep talking about that one. Apart from the story, what's interesting about it is that it covers both the military power of a large empire, which we're always all aware of. You get the colonization, wars, invasion side. But on the other hand, you also get what I guess in civilizations in the computer game we would call the cultural victory, where large empires also have literature, have cultural things that get taken over. What have the Romans ever done for us? From The Life of Brian comes to mind, and the list is really long. So those are two parts of sometimes the same thing. And I thought the memory called Empire does a really good job discussing that side in a science fiction setting.
Charles is asking, what was the book you were referring to? Can you type that into the chat?
Yes.
Okay. And yeah, the Klingons have lots of myth and legends. I've heard a little bit of, I've followed Star Trek, but not fully. So I've heard the legend of Kahless and his brother fighting. There we go. It's yeah, that's really well done. And I read Foundation, but I didn't read the whole trilogy, so maybe I should. Thanks for that suggestion. We should move on though to our next topic, which is clerical necromancy. We researched the history of magic when we were writing our historical fantasy game, and here's an oddity that Vesna is going to tell us about.
Yes, and I promise not to go into the other side of this oddity, which is that it comes out of the investiture conflict, which is, my big thing in medieval history. But but the picture that we're looking at here is Pope Sylvester II talking to the devil, and it comes out of a series of accusations against Sylvester II for clerical necromancy. It wasn't just Sylvester II who was into this, though. The historian Kieckhefer, who now is no longer cutting edge, but still worth reading on a variety of magic and in general, occultism and the history thereof topics, says that there was a necromantic underground among monks and clerics. And that they were all exchanging books, exchanging information, annotating glosses. So yes, and he wrote other books besides magic in the Middle Ages as well, and they're all worth looking into. But when we're talking about clerical necromancy, what are we talking about? So it's not about monks creating armies of the restless dead, which is probably the first thing that comes to our minds when we think of necromancy, because that's how it works in D&D. The concept of necromancy comes from nigromantia, which just means black magic. And for monks, practicing black magic means that they're summoning demons, that they're conversing with demons, they're making deals with them, and using their assistance to find lost items or create potions or do whatever it is a person might want to do through magic. Now, the term demons is, a little bit problematic because in Greek, it used to refer to just spirits that could be harmful, but they could also be helpful to humans. And in general, magic was seen as more neutral. It's something that could be good or bad. Greeks had a concept of black magic as well. It's when you do bad things to good people using magic. And practitioners were punished both in the Greek and in the Roman world. And it's interesting to note that it's very often, quote unquote, foreign magic. So magic belonging either to other people's religions or to other people's just cultural background were seen as suspect. In a medieval context, magic is inherently suspect. But it's kind of too simplistic to say that all Christian countries just flat out condemn practitioners of magic. Thou shalt not be allowed to, thou shalt not allow a witch to live and all of that stuff, and just persecuted them on sight. Laws really ranged from persecute on sight to it's okay-ish if you're not hurting anybody or, summoning any demons. And to add to that, in the 13th century, something really interesting is happening. Arabic learning is also increasingly available in Europe. And it brings back Aristotle, it introduces Avicenna, but then there are also texts about alchemy, for example. So there's magic that's coming from a Muslim tradition that's also considered suspect, though not necessarily persecuted, especially if it promises to create gold for an emperor or king who is really tired of begging Parliament for money. So we'll get a little bit more into that in a second. Since we started talking about the law, which is my favorite topic in history, I guess it's important to say that some clergy were accused of necromancy. And when you look at the extant records, some of it was talking to demons. One monk got busted for doing unspeakable things to cats. And I'm not going to go into details because I have cats and I happen to like them very much. Anyway, he got busted doing unspeakable things to cats as part of a ritual that was supposed to help him catch a thief who had made off with something of value. So there were accusations of necromancy, but not everybody got convicted. Some of the monks who were accused got off either because they managed to argue for the harmlessness of their approach. So yeah, it's necromancy, or yeah, it's astrology, but it has nothing to do with demons, which iffy, or by explaining that their approach, was a rational field of inquiry. And we'll get into that in a bit. Some of it also, just as it is today, is political slander. Like there was this big thing about Pope Sylvester II, not just practicing necromancy, but also never going to sleep without his grimoire under his pillow and all of that. It makes for a really cool story. And in fact, I just absolutely love the idea of the necromancer Pope for fiction. It's also part of a political slander campaign at the time by his political opponents. So in the real historical sense, take with a grain of salt. In a real life fiction sense, run with it. It's cool. The other thing that's interesting is that, for example, in the 16th century, John Dee was an undergrad in Cambridge, and as part of what we would nowadays call a school play, he created some special effects. And apparently those were some banging special effects because they got him accused of witchcraft. Now, he was able to defend himself by showing that no actual magic had been involved in the creation of said stage effects. But he also proceeded to practice astrology. He read the stars for, say, Queen Elizabeth's coronation and set the date to a astrologically auspicious time. And he also ended up talking to spirits that taught him the mystic language of creation. And so he was never accused of witchcraft again, although he clearly didn't stop his practice of the magical arts. So obviously not every kind of witchcraft, everybody was going to just grab you and burn you at the stake. Again, how useful magic is has a lot to do with it. Elizabeth I consulted Dee for her horoscope. Emperor Maximilian in Prague and Ivan the Terrible in Russia had court wizards and alchemists. And, they were hoping for gold. Their government needed money. They were sick and tired of taxing people and said people getting really cranky and rising up against taxation or having to beg parliament for money. So if somebody could actually create gold for you, this was going to be awesome. And so in this context, I guess for world building, it makes sense to consider if attitudes towards magic change over time, and if there are certain kinds of magic that are acceptable and others that aren't, and then what is it about it that makes it acceptable or not? How does culture play into it? And, who is it useful to? Oh, yep, there's the so yes,
state the question so
okay,
people
how are you? How have you any insights regarding this type of necromancy relating to the Rosicrucian movement, alchemy, and the Rosy Cross? So alchemy tended to be a little bit less focused around talking to spirits by and large, although I don't know how else to put it. A lot of people who practiced magic of some sort were magical polymaths, so they didn't necessarily just stick to alchemy. I think you see a lot of really rich traditions that pull from whatever source they can find. So I haven't looked into the specifics, but I think there's no reason to not connect the two.
I can say a little bit more.
Yeah.
There's separate movements. Clerical necromancy started earlier. Alchemy started pretty early too, but they were separate for a while.
Alchemy is an import. That's part of it. Alchemy is a fairly late import.
Yep. Until a momentous event happened called the Gutenberg printing press. Then texts about both branches of magic became available, and they began to cross-pollinate each other, and I think eventually unify into an occult tradition, to oversimplify.
And we are actually about to get into some of this, because to get back to the necromantic monks, I think it's really important to consider that they're highly educated people, and that before the rise of the universities, monasteries were really the main place you would go to get an education. Once you have universities, the number of scholars overall increases. Clerical necromancy kind of moved from the monasteries to the universities. And until, say, the 15th century, for example, priors were very, very lenient with monks who were accused of clerical necromancy, and tried to get them off of those charges. As practice kind of spreads and moves into the more secular universities, priors are less tolerant of monks practicing this. And with the advent of the printing press in the 15th century, access to written text just increased. It's really worth mentioning that before then, it made sense for scholars to read any book they can get their hands on. Books were few and far between, and you don't want to miss your chance to learn something new. With the printing press, suddenly you had access to things you would never have seen before. It's not just monks scribbling away in cells and copying volumes over months. You do an offset print run, and you have hundreds of copies of a thing very quickly, and it can spread much further. And obviously, clerical necromancy is an educated version of magic. It requires Greek and Latin. It has references to Plato in it. This is not village wise women distilling herbal remedies that they learned from their mother. And that also explains why educated clergy and monks were able to defend themselves much better in court, because they essentially shared a language with the courts. And by the way, so did scientists of the time. For example, the astronomer Johannes Kepler's mother was accused of witchcraft. Yep. And as a learned academic who understood the reasoning behind the accusations and, could examine them critically and then refute them point by point, he was able to get her acquitted, and she lived a long and prosperous life after that. So yeah, it's a good thing to consider whether magic requires education, or it's something that you learn from your grandmother, and whether there was change over time. Change over time does make the world more realistic, and George R.R. Martin is a good example of that. His world is just full of change. So yes, are there any surviving texts or grimoires that go into detail about this topic? If you start looking for translations of grimoires, actually there's a lot in for early modern magic. Medieval, not so much. I mean, I've seen a grimoire of Pope Sylvester II. The library had a copy when I was in graduate school,
It was
but
about 1000 AD, Pope Sylvester was, right?
yeah, he was part of the investiture conflict. So we're looking at the 11th century, but really there aren't that many. But if you start looking for Renaissance ones, I mean, we actually bought a bunch because
So
we
I've got a
were.
stack of them. We've read them all, so you don't have to. And we made a
But if you
game
want
out of
to, you
it.
can, which is
Yeah, no,
great.
you can. That's true.
Yep. And I want to wrap
So,
this up fairly soon because I know we have another whole topic, but there's one thing that I did want to bring up, which is that in our world, science and religion and magic are separate. We as modern scholars get very, very uncomfortable when we read about Isaac Newton practicing alchemy, for example, or philosophers tying themselves into knots because Descartes may have tried to include the Christian God as part of a rational cosmology. That's not how we think about this because we separate our approaches to knowledge. Like, I don't expect a physicist to make a discovery that will answer all questions in medicine, computer science, geology, and music. That's not how we think. In the early modern period, in the Middle Ages, and in antiquity, scholars saw things quite differently. There was a belief that there's a universal truth, a fundamental principle of nature that if you understand it, you can instantly make sense of everything. And maybe it'll even let you manipulate reality. And the best example of that I've ever seen in fiction is The Matrix. Once you know and understand that your entire reality is a computer simulation, everything you've seen and experienced kind of snaps into place. And you can both understand and manipulate the rules of the simulation because you grasp the core truth and you know that the rules that apply to computer simulations will apply to reality. And ancient, medieval, and early modern scholars believed that there was such a universal truth and that magic, science, and theology were just all different methods of getting at it. They believed that anything you learned revealed a facet of a universal law. And for example, Pythagoras thought that geometry could be used to understand everything about the world. He also expected deep understanding of mathematical principles underlying reality to give him the ability to manipulate it. Also, he ran a cult and his cult was co-ed and they apparently had a very good time. That's just on the side. But I'll say just one more thing and then I'm done with this. John Dee, whom we mostly know as a wizard and astrologer, was also a highly accomplished mathematician, and he studied geography under Mercator, the guy behind the Mercator projection that we still use to show maps of the world today. And so it's interesting to think about when creating a world, whether there's an underlying universal truth in your world. Is it generally known? Is it hidden? Is it revealed by gods or spirits? Is it something that only a select few can discover? Are magic, science, and religion separate? Are they the same thing? And given the view, like, who comes off as wackadoodle? Because somebody in a world who does something peculiar will always come off as not being quite sane. And that's what I have to say about clerical necromancy.
All right. I want to talk about taming of the nobility, changing topics, because I was aware that the British nobility are less important than they were at some point in history. They're also more important than they were at some point in history as well. I came from Ars Magica, which is about the medieval period, where the king had a royal council that was where he surrounded himself partly by some knights, but also by the high nobles of the realm, the Duke of Cornwall and the Duke of York and so on. And I was expecting to see the same thing into the Renaissance. I didn't. And I found out there was really a fairly sharp cutoff point, which is the start of the Tudor dynasty. The historians say that the Tudors, the Tudor monarchs included Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. So it was a Renaissance dynasty. And historians say that they tamed the nobility. Now, they did this because they had to, because the Tudor dynasty emerged from the Wars of the Roses. And I'm juxtaposing it with Game of Thrones, because if you think Game of Thrones is harsh and wrenching and hard to follow, then the Wars of the Roses will be too much for you. The Wars of the Roses are plural. There was more than one war. It was a 30-year period of rebellions and coup d'etat and intrigues and conspiracies. There was betrayal. There was regicide. The throne changed hands six times in 30 years. And at the end of it, there emerged a ruler, Henry VII, Tudor. Now, speaking of overlooked history, the role of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, really needs attention here. She was the architect of the piece. Henry Tudor grew up during the Wars of the Roses. They were his whole life, and he had a weak claim to the throne, but everybody with a stronger claim kept getting bumped off. Lady Margaret saw which way this is going, right? And she also saw that he had a claim to the throne, and she architected an alliance of kingmakers who could get behind Henry's claim. They deposed the hated usurper from the other house. Henry Tudor was from the House of Lancaster, and Richard III, the hated usurper, was from the House of York. So some of the Yorkists double-crossed Richard III, sided with Henry, switched sides suddenly in a battle, and Richard III is dead. Long live Henry VII. And as part of the deal, Henry married Elizabeth of York, so they unified the two houses. What this means is the next king after Henry VII is going to be the grandchild of a Yorkist, the nephew of Yorkists. So what the Yorkists get out of this is that they are becoming kin to the dynasty a generation later. That's their personal interest in a marriage alliance. So when Henry came to power, he actually didn't have a power base. He didn't have a strong army. He was not a strong man. And he was only as good as the alliance of kingmakers who were behind him. So he had to take steps to ensure that his head was going to stay attached to his shoulders, that there was not going to be another rebellion against him like he had just done to Richard III. He ended up winning the peace and securing the Tudor dynasty, but it was by no means certain that the Wars of the Roses were over when he took power. His playbook included lawyers, guns, and money, like any good, dynastic security plan. And he made bold moves. the first thing he did was he backdated his accession by 1 day to the day before the battle he fought. What that means is that anybody who stood against him could be accused of treason. This is total gaslighting. He just faked the date, but he got his allies to sign on to it, and it became official. So he's officially king 1 day before Richard III gets defeated. Now, he didn't use this to round up his enemies and charge them for treason and have a purge like, say, a 20th century usurper would do. I'm thinking of like Stalin. He didn't do that. What he did instead was he used the threat of a charge of treason to force obedience. He would say, well, I noticed that you were on the wrong side of this battle, but I'll forgive you if you will pledge loyalty to me and support my agenda. You need to not just say it, you need to walk the walk and support my agenda. And his agenda included banning private armies. He had to get Parliament's support for this, but Parliament is half the House of Commons. The House of Commons doesn't want the high nobles to have private armies. So you're halfway there. And I don't know exactly how he pulled it off, but I'm going to imagine how I would do it if I were in his place. I would ban large private armies, and then all the lower nobles who couldn't afford an army that big anyway will sign on to it. I would limit the size of private armies, and I know that that's what he did. He put taxes on large retinues of servants, and that made it impractical for people to have armies. The Wars of the Roses were fought with the personal household troops of the various earls and dukes, and he made it impractical for them to sustain a standing army. As a side note, the reason guns come into play is, in my view, this dismantling of private armies is the reason that the longbow was supplanted by firearms, because the private armies were longbow archers. But when there is less work for longbow archers, there's no financial incentive to commit to the training route. And that means the number of archers available, trained archers available, shrunk to an unsustainable point, and guns replaced longbow. I had to get that in there. I know it's beyond, we're looking beyond battles, but he pulled this off, and he pulled it off quickly. I was surprised. I can imagine also that the nobles were war weary, and a lot of them were probably bankrupt or cash strapped. So a good diplomat like Henry's mom could have sold the idea of dismantling private armies. And really, they didn't come back. This was a permanent change in England, where the dukes and earls no longer they could raise troops, but they didn't have standing armies personally attached to them. And the quality of the troops, I don't think, was as good. With lawyers, Henry found all kinds of medieval laws with fines and fees attached to them. And he started going after the nobles to garnish their incomes, to squeeze money out of them. Take money away from your potential rivals and give it to yourself. This is something the king could do. And he didn't need Parliament to do it because the laws were already on the books. He was extremely unpopular for this. It got to the point where his lawyers were finding laws that nobody had seen before, if you take my meaning. There was widespread abuse.
Although you don't have to look too far, because one thing I find funny, for example, the state of Massachusetts in the US has loads of laws on the books that are ridiculous now, but are still there. There's one where you're not allowed to drive at night unless somebody's running ahead of you with a lantern. And
Running
I
ahead
would
of
be
your car,
really,
right?
really mad if, I got fined for that and given a ticket. So yeah, that's the kind of law we're talking about.
Yeah, that's the sort of thing he was doing. He also used predatory. Oh, he invented invented new taxes. He applied taxes in creative ways, and his lawyers applied taxes in creative ways. His tax collectors were so hated that when his successor Henry VIII came to power, as a gesture to appease the public, Henry VIII threw his father's tax collectors under the bus, had them executed on trumped up charges, just to distance himself from his father's tax policy. So that says something about both Henry VII and Henry VIII. Right? It became a habit for Henry VIII to throw people under the bus, and his method was charges of treason. A word about treason: they were following Roman tradition, where if somebody's convicted of treason, their property is seized by the crown. This is a huge conflict of interest. Like today, it blows our minds. And I'm afraid that I'm running out of time, but the last trick in the Tudor playbook was letting noble titles die out. This is a royal power that he didn't have to seize. It was already his. That if a duke or an earl or a baron, landed nobility, has no heir, the title reverts to the crown, and they can give it to whomever they want or not. And what Henry VII did is, when a family died out, he just sat on the title. Now, it's harder than you might think to sustain an unbroken male line of succession. Noble families had about a 1% attrition rate. And the population of the nobility at various ranks went back and forth over time. There are more nobles now in England than there were at the beginning of the Tudor dynasty, and certainly more than there were at the end of the Tudor dynasty, which is just a fascinating fact. So in your world, there can be a dynamic between the noble class and the monarchy. I thought that this was a continuous trend of increasing royal power and authority, but it's actually gone back and forth, or at least it can go back and forth. I'll put it that way. And Henry VII gives us a tyrant's playbook of how royal authority can be imposed rapidly. It's stuck. I will say this much: as unpopular as his things were, as brutal and unethical as his moves were, when his son came to power, Henry VII died. His son, Henry VIII, was 17 years old and enjoyed the first peaceful ascension to the throne in England in 100 years. So Henry VII was a ruthless tyrant. He was effective at securing his dynasty. And I'm sorry, I don't have... I was surprised at this comment, much fewer nobles than I would have expected for the time. I was surprised too. That's why I picked this topic. So Sorry that I don't have a lot of time left for discussion about this topic, but I want to say thank you to everybody for coming. I'll wrap up the recording. Well, I hope you enjoyed the talk. I hope you enjoy the rest of the convention.